The titans of old are awakening once again, ready to reclaim their place in a world that has grown cold and mechanical. Witness the epic scale of our latest series, where legends return to the light of day. Click subscribe now and be there for the return. I had $47 million sitting in 7 different accounts, and my own daughter looked at me like I was something she had scraped off the bottom of her shoe. She had no idea. None of them did. They saw an old man in a faded flannel shirt who drove a 10-year-old pickup truck and clipped grocery coupons on Sunday mornings. They saw someone who had already served his purpose in life. They saw a burden. What they didn't see was the man who had quietly built one of the most profitable private medical device companies in the state of Texas, sold it for a number that had 9 figures in it, and then gone right back to living exactly the way he always had, because the money was never the point. The point was the work. And now the work was done, and the only thing left was watching my daughter choose a man who wore his ambition like a Halloween costume, pretending to be something he would never become. Before I tell you how I walked into that hotel ballroom and dismantled everything my son-in-law had spent 3 years building with other people's money, please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that respect should never be conditional on what someone has in their bank account. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Walter Greer, and this is the last lesson I ever had to teach. The engagement party was held at the Worthington Hotel in downtown Fort Worth. My daughter, my only child, was marrying a man named Preston Albright. Preston had the kind of face that photographed well, and the kind of handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too long. He had grown up in the suburbs of Dallas in a house where the appearance of wealth was maintained with the precision of a military operation, even when the water bill was 2 months past due. He had married into ambition the way some men marry into money, desperately, gratefully, and with an eye on the exit strategy before the ink was even dry. My daughter's name was Caroline. She was 34 years old and the most brilliant person I had ever known until she met Preston, and slowly, methodically, began filing down her own edges to fit the shape of the life he wanted. By the time the engagement was announced, she barely looked like herself anymore. She wore different clothes, used different words, laughed at different things. She had become the supporting character in someone else's story, and she didn't even seem to notice. I arrived at the party early. I was wearing a sport coat I had owned since 2008, and a pair of dark slacks that were clean but visibly not expensive. I didn't dress this way to make a point. I dressed this way because I genuinely didn't care about clothes. I had spent 30 years in hospital hallways and engineering labs. My uniform was function, not fashion. The hotel lobby smelled like fresh lilies and old money pretending to be new. The event was on the 4th floor in the Grand Cascade Ballroom. 200 guests, open bar, a jazz quartet in the corner. Preston's parents had insisted on footing the bill for the event, and they had made absolutely certain that every dollar of that decision was visible from the moment you stepped off the elevator. A woman I didn't recognize stopped me near the coat check. She looked at my jacket, then at my shoes, then back at my face, with the particular expression people reserve for someone who has clearly arrived at the wrong building. "Are you with catering?" she asked. I told her I was the father of the bride. She blinked twice and moved on without another word. Preston's mother, Diane Albright, spotted me from across the room. She was a woman of sharp geometry, sharp cheekbones, sharp elbows, sharp opinions delivered with the blunt force of a woman who had never once doubted her own taste. She glided over with a glass of champagne she didn't offer to share. "Walter," she said, "the way you say a word you're not sure how to pronounce. You made it." I told her I wouldn't have missed it. She looked at my jacket again. She looked at it the way an architect looks at a condemned building with detached professional disappointment. "We're seating family at the center tables," she said, "but we thought it might be more comfortable for you to sit near the back, near the windows. You'll have a lovely view of the parking structure." I told her the parking structure sounded fine. I found my seat. It was, in fact, near a window. The view was exactly as described. I sat with my water glass and watched 200 people eat shrimp cocktail and perform their social identities for each other. Caroline found me 40 minutes into the party. She was wearing a dress, the color of champagne, and a smile that didn't quite reach the corners of her eyes. She hugged me, and I held on for a second longer than she expected. "You look beautiful," I told her. "You could have worn the blue blazer," she whispered. "I like this one." She pulled back and looked at me with something complicated moving behind her eyes. For a moment the old Caroline was there, the one who used to sit on my workbench at midnight asking me how the human heart pumped 35 million times a year without once taking a break. Then Preston appeared at her shoulder, like a weather system, moving in from the west. He was wearing a navy suit that fit him like a promise. He was the kind of handsome that requires maintenance, regular haircuts, careful grooming, a studied casualness that costs money to achieve. He shook my hand with the 1-second handshake. "Walter," he said, "good of you to come out," as if I had driven in from a neighboring county to attend a county fair, as if I were a pleasant but ultimately unnecessary addition to the evening. "I wouldn't miss my daughter's engagement party," I said. He smiled. It was a smile with the warmth of a thermostat set to 68 degrees. Functional, controlled. "Of course," he said. Then he wrapped his arm around Caroline and steered her back toward the center of the room, back toward the people who mattered for the purposes of that evening. He looked back at me once over his shoulder. "Get some shrimp, Walter," he said. "The cocktail sauce is excellent." I got some shrimp. The cocktail sauce was indeed excellent. I sat by the window and I watched. I watched Preston work the room. I had spent 30 years studying how systems function under pressure, and Preston Albright was a system I could read as easily as a schematic. He moved from group to group with the efficiency of a circuit completing itself. With older men he was deferential and attentive. With younger men he was collegial and confident. With women he was charming in a way that was just calibrated enough to be flattering without being threatening. He was performing, and he was performing well. But I had been in enough boardrooms to know the difference between a man who has built something and a man who is borrowing someone else's credibility. 2 months before the engagement was announced, an old colleague of mine had called me from Houston. His name was Dennis Hartwell, and he had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant before his retirement. We had worked together on a legal dispute involving patent infringement back in 2012. Dennis didn't call to chat. Dennis called because he had seen Preston Albright's name on a prospectus that had crossed his desk, and something in the numbers had made him reach for the phone. "The margins don't make sense, Walter," he had said. "The revenue projections are beautiful on paper, too beautiful. The kind of beautiful that means somebody is either a genius or a liar, and I've lived long enough to know those two things are not the same." I had listened. Then I had started paying attention. Preston's company was called Apex Forward Capital. It was a private investment firm that positioned itself as a bridge between high-net-worth individuals and emerging real estate development opportunities in the Sunbelt corridor. The pitch was elegant. Underserved secondary markets, population growth, driving housing demand, proprietary deal flow from an exclusive network of developers. The returns he was promising consistently and in writing were mathematically implausible unless every assumption he was making was simultaneously and perfectly correct. And in my experience, when every assumption has to be perfect for a model to work, the model is already broken. The investor money that was coming in wasn't being deployed. It was being circulated. New money paying old returns. The oldest trick in the book, dressed up in a Patagonia vest and a TED Talk vocabulary. I didn't tell Caroline. I needed proof first, not suspicion, and I needed to understand exactly how deep the water was before I decided whether to throw my daughter a rope or let her learn to swim. I spent the 6 months between the engagement party and the wedding watching. I hired Dennis and 2 of his associates to follow the money. I retained a lawyer named Margaret Okafor, who had spent 15 years in securities litigation and had the kind of eyes that had seen every variation of financial fraud that human creativity could produce. I had known Margaret since she was a first-year associate at the firm that had represented my company during its sale. She was precise, relentless, and had once reduced a hostile witness to complete silence with a single document and 14 seconds of eye contact. I also did something that cost me more than the legal fees. I told my daughter nothing. I watched her plan a wedding to a man I was increasingly certain was going to be arrested before their 5th anniversary. I watched her choose a venue in Napa Valley, and a dress that required 3 fittings. I watched her believe in a future that was being built on a foundation that was already cracking. I sat with that silence, the way you sit with a diagnosis you're not ready to share. You hold it, you verify it, you make sure. Then, 3 weeks before the wedding, Dennis called again. He didn't say hello, he said. Walter, the FBI has an open investigation. It's been running for 14 months. They're close. I asked him how close. He said, 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe less if a witness cooperates. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Home Depot for 22 minutes after that call, looking at the steering wheel. 6 to 8 weeks. The wedding was in 3. I drove home. I pulled out a legal pad. I wrote 2 words at the top. Protect Caroline. Everything else, Preston, Apex Forward, the investor money, the fraud, the inevitable collapse. Everything else was secondary to those 2 words. I had spent 34 years protecting that woman from everything I could see coming. This was just the largest thing I had ever had to prepare for. The next morning I called Margaret. I told her we needed to move. She already knew. She had been in contact with a federal agent named Carver who was overseeing the investigation. The case against Preston was not theoretical. It was documented. 41 investors. $11.3 million taken in. Less than $2 million actually deployed. The rest had gone to operational expenses, personal accounts, and the systematic maintenance of a lifestyle that had no legitimate income source to support it. Margaret asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to protect my daughter from the criminal liability that could attach itself to a spouse who appeared to benefit from fraud proceeds. I told her I wanted to ensure that when the indictment came down, Caroline's name was not on a single document, account, or asset that Preston controlled. And I told her I needed to do it before the wedding, without Preston knowing it was happening. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Walter, that's going to require her to sign some things. I said I knew. She asked if Caroline was going to cooperate. I told her Caroline was going to have to know the truth first. That conversation with my daughter was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the 18 months after her mother died. Harder than the morning I sold the company and realized I had nothing left to build. I drove to her apartment on a Wednesday afternoon, and I sat across from her at the kitchen table, and I told her everything. I told her about Dennis. I told her about the forensic analysis. I told her about the FBI investigation. I told her about the 14 months of documented fraud. I told her about the 41 families who had invested their retirement money and their savings and their children's college funds into a company that was using it to pay for the life she was planning to build. She didn't cry right away. She went very still, the way she used to go still as a child when she was absorbing something too large to process immediately. She sat with her hands flat on the table and she looked at the wall behind my head and she breathed. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her 6 months. She looked at me then, and the expression on her face was something I hope I never have to see again. Not anger, not grief exactly, but the specific devastation of a person realizing that the story of their own life has a chapter they were never shown. "You should have told me," she said. "I needed to be certain first," I said. "I needed to make sure I wasn't taking something from you based on suspicion." "He's going to prison," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do I need to sign?" We spent the next 4 days with Margaret restructuring everything. Caroline's name came off the joint accounts they had opened in anticipation of the wedding. The engagement gift, money her grandmother had sent, went into an account Preston had no access to. A prenuptial agreement was drafted that made airtight the separation of any assets she brought into the marriage, including, very specifically, any inheritance from me, which at that point Preston and his family believed amounted to a modest retirement account and the equity in a house in a suburb of Fort Worth. They had no idea that the inheritance they were not getting was $47 million. Preston signed the prenuptial agreement without reading it carefully. His attorney reviewed it and told him it was standard. It was not standard, but Preston was not paying close enough attention because Preston was not worried. He believed he was marrying a woman whose father was a retired engineer with a pickup truck and a coupon habit. He believed there was nothing of consequence to protect against. That was the first mistake he made in my presence. It would not be the last. The wedding was beautiful. The venue in Napa was everything Caroline had wanted. Rolling hills going golden in the October light, long tables draped in white linen, candles in mason jars, the smell of oak and lavender mixing in the afternoon air. 120 guests. I walked my daughter down the aisle, and I held her hand, and I looked at the man waiting for her at the end of it, and I thought, you have no idea what is coming. I smiled through the ceremony. I danced with Caroline at the reception. I made a toast that was warm and genuine, and said nothing about the 6 months I had spent building a firewall around my daughter's financial future. The guests laughed and raised their glasses, and Diane Albright, seated at the head family table in a mother-of-the-groom dress that cost more than my first car, looked at me with the particular tolerant contempt she had maintained since the engagement party. During cocktail hour, Preston found me standing near the bar. He was loose with champagne and victory. He put his hand on my shoulder the way men do when they have decided they have won something. "We're family now, Walter," he said. "We are," I said. He looked at the view, the vineyards, the golden hills, the beautiful architecture of his carefully constructed performance. "I want you to know," he said, lowering his voice to the register men use when they're about to offer something they believe is generous, "that you don't have to worry anymore. About Caroline, about her future. I'm going to take very good care of her." I looked at him. I looked at him the way I used to look at an engineering prototype before I decided whether it was ready to be trusted with actual patience, carefully, without sentiment. "I know you will," I said. He smiled and moved back toward the center of the party, toward the light, toward the people who reflected his image back at him the way he needed it reflected. I finished my water and took out my phone. I typed a single message to Margaret. It said, "It's done. Be ready." The indictment came down 11 weeks after the wedding, on a Tuesday morning in February, when the temperature in Fort Worth had dropped below freezing and the city had the gray, brittle quality of something that might crack if you pushed it too hard. I was at home when Margaret called. She told me the arrest had happened at 7:15 in the morning, at the house Preston and Caroline had been renting in the Rivercrest neighborhood. 2 federal agents. Standard procedure. Preston had been walked out in his bathrobe while the neighbors were leaving for work. I asked about Caroline. Margaret said she was fine. Scared, but fine. The agents had been briefed on her cooperation status, and had treated her accordingly. She was not a target. She had known this was coming, and she had spent 11 weeks quietly, systematically, removing herself from every traceable connection to Preston's finances. She was clean. I drove to her house. She was sitting at the kitchen table in a sweatshirt when I arrived. She looked like she hadn't slept. She probably hadn't. I made coffee the way I had made it for her since she was a teenager strong, with 1 sugar, and I sat across from her, and I didn't say anything for a while. Finally, she said, "It's really over." "Yes," I said. "People lost their money, Dad." Her voice was very quiet. "Real people, families." "I know," I said. "Margaret has been working with the prosecutor's office on restitution. Some of it is recoverable." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. She stared at the table. "How did you know?" she said. "How did you see it when I couldn't?" I thought about that for a moment. "Because I wasn't in love with him," I said. "Love is a brilliant thing, but it changes the angle of the light." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "You never told me about the money. Your money. All of it." "No," I said. "Why not?" I looked at my daughter, 34 years old, brilliant, sitting in a kitchen in a house that was about to have a for rent sign in the front yard, with a marriage that was 11 weeks old and already finished, and I thought about the right answer to that question. "Because I wanted to know who you would become if you thought you were on your own," I said, "and because I wanted to be sure that when someone loved you, they were loving you, not the number." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Did anyone ever love you just for the number?" "Your mother didn't know the number either," I said. "Not for the first 8 years. That made her smile. It was small and tired and real. It was the most honest smile I had seen on her face in 3 years. The criminal proceedings took 14 months. The trial was held in the Northern District of Texas. Preston's attorney was expensive and technically skilled, and he mounted a defense built on the argument that Preston had made optimistic but good faith projections that had simply failed to materialize in an unpredictable market. Margaret dismantled it document by document. She put the financial records on the screen and walked the jury through them with the patience and clarity of someone who has spent decades translating complexity into comprehension. She showed them the gap between what Preston had told investors their money was doing and what it was actually doing. She showed them the transfers. She showed them the timeline. She showed them the emails, the ones in which Preston, in language that was direct and unambiguous, had told colleagues that the returns he was reporting to investors were, in his own words, Illustrative rather than actual. That was the phrase that ended it. Illustrative rather than actual. The jury was out for 9 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict on 6 counts, including wire fraud and securities fraud. I was in the courtroom for the verdict. I sat in the gallery, wearing the same sport coat I had worn to the engagement party, and I watched Preston stand at the defense table and receive what was coming to him. Diane Albright was 2 rows ahead of me. When the verdict was read, she made a sound I will not describe. Her husband put his arm around her shoulders and stared straight ahead. Preston turned around to look at the gallery before the marshals moved to him. His eyes went past his parents, past his friends, and found me sitting in the back of the room in my old jacket. He looked at me for a long time. I didn't look away. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Restitution was ordered in the full amount plus interest. It would take him most of his adult life to pay it back, if he ever did. Margaret found me in the hallway after the sentencing. She shook my hand. She told me it was a good result. "It's a just result," I said. "There's a difference." The day after the sentencing, I drove to a dinner called Hattie's Kitchen on the east side of Fort Worth, about 4 miles from the house where Caroline and I had lived for 12 years after her mother died. It was the kind of place that had been there since before I arrived in Fort Worth. The kind of place with a hand-painted sign and coffee, served in ceramic mugs with small chips in the handles, and a pecan pie that was better than any pecan pie had a right to be. Caroline was already there when I arrived. She was looking at the menu even though she had been coming to this diner since she was 9 years old and had never once ordered anything other than the chicken and waffles. I sat across from her. The waitress, a woman named Ruth Ann, who had worked there longer than I'd been a customer, brought coffee without being asked. We sat for a moment in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and are still locating themselves on the other side of it. "I want to show you something," I said. I reached into the inside pocket of my sport coat and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. I placed it on the table and slid it toward her. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a 1-page summary from my financial attorney, not a full accounting, just the headline number, the structure, and the name of the trust I had established. She read it. She read it again. She set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. "Dad," she said. "I know," I said. "This is—" "Yes." She looked at the paper. She looked at me. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because now I know you don't need it," I said. "And that's the only time it's safe to give someone something this large." She was quiet. Outside the window, the morning traffic moved along the street. Ruth Ann refilled my coffee without asking. The pecan pie rotated slowly in the glass display case by the register. "I spent 3 years," Caroline said, "feeling like I had to be with him because he was the one with the plan. He was the one with the vision. And all this time, you were the plan," I said. "You always were. The rest of it was just noise." She folded the paper and held it in both hands. She looked out the window for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to go back to work. The research position." I turned it down because Preston thought it wasn't. She stopped. She started again. "I want to go back." I nodded. "Then go back. Will you help me?" "I'll stay out of your way," I said. "That's the best help I know how to give." She looked at me then. I really looked at me at the old sport coat, and the coffee mug, and the face of the man who had spent 40 years building something, and then spent 3 more years waiting quietly to make sure the right person got to inherit it. "I love you," she said. "I know you do," I said. "Eat your chicken and waffles." She laughed. It was the real one, the one that goes all the way to the corners, the one that sounds like her mother's. I paid the check. I left Ruth Ann a tip that made her stop and look at the table twice. I walked out into the February morning, into the cold, bright air of a city I had lived in for 30 years, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the pale sky. $47 million. A daughter who knew now. A verdict on the record. A man serving time for the damage he had done to 41 families who had trusted him with their futures. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, something I had not expected. The quiet, steady feeling of a thing resolved. Not triumph. Not vindication. Something simpler and more durable than either of those. The feeling of a debt paid. Not the money kind. The other kind. The one you carry in your chest for the years you spend protecting someone who doesn't know they need it. I buttoned my coat against the wind. I walked to my truck. It was still the same truck 10 years old, reliable, worth exactly what it looked like it was worth and not a dollar more. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward home. I have learned at 68 years old that the most expensive thing a person can own is someone else's opinion of their worth. I spent 30 years building something real, and I nearly lost the only thing that mattered because I stayed quiet too long. But I also learned this, that there is a version of love that looks like patience, that looks like watching, that looks like sitting in the back of a room in an old sport coat and saying nothing until the moment requires everything. That version of love is not dramatic. It doesn't make for a great toast at a dinner party, but it is the version that holds when everything else is falling apart. If you're watching this, and you know what it feels like to be underestimated by someone who should know better, someone who looked at you and saw only what you were wearing, only what you drove, only what you didn't have, I want you to know that the math always corrects itself eventually. Stay patient, stay quiet, stay building. The reveal takes care of itself. If this story meant something to you, please hit the like button and subscribe to Midnight Vengeance for more. And tell me in the comments, would you have warned your daughter sooner, or would you have waited like I did? I want to know what you think.